What if everything you believe about death is wrong? What if the terror that grips your chest when you think about dying is actually the very thing keeping you from truly living? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most uncomfortable truths that both Carl Jung and Baruch Spinoza dared to reveal about death, and why understanding this could completely transform how you experience every single day of your life. Most people spend their entire existence running from death. They fill their days with distractions, chase endless goals, accumulate possessions, build careers, all while secretly hoping that if they just stay busy enough, death will somehow forget about them. But Jung understood something profound that most people never realize. He wrote in his work, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that the fear of death is not really about death itself. It's about the fear of not having truly lived. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you made a decision based on what you truly wanted, rather than what you thought would keep you safe? When did you last take a risk that mattered, speak a truth that needed to be said, or pursue something that set your soul on fire? Most of us are so busy avoiding death that we forget to embrace life. Spinoza approached this from a completely different angle, but arrived at an equally revolutionary conclusion. In his Ethics, he argued that death is not the opposite of life. Death is simply the absence of life, just as darkness is the absence of light. But here's where it gets interesting. Spinoza believed that our fear of death actually comes from our misunderstanding of what we truly are. You see, most people think they are their body. They identify completely with this flesh and bone vessel, and when they imagine it decomposing, they panic. But Spinoza suggested that you are not your body. You are not even your thoughts or emotions. You are something far more fundamental. You are a unique expression of the infinite creative force of existence itself. Let me tell you about a patient Jung once treated. This was a successful businessman who came to Jung because he was having panic attacks every time he thought about dying. He was in his 50s, had achieved everything society told him he should want, but he couldn't sleep because he kept imagining his funeral. Jung didn't try to comfort him with platitudes about heaven or reassure him that he had many years left. Instead, he asked him a simple question that changed everything. What would you do differently if you knew you were going to die in exactly 1 year? The man's entire demeanor shifted. He started talking about places he'd never visited, conversations he'd never had with his children, creative projects he'd abandoned, love he'd never expressed. Jung smiled and said, "Then why aren't you doing those things now?" This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be. And he believed that most people never individuate because they're too afraid of death to truly live. Spinoza would have agreed completely, but he would have added something crucial. He believed that when you understand your true nature, when you realize that you are an eternal aspect of infinite being, the fear of death naturally dissolves. Not because you become immortal in some supernatural sense, but because you recognize that what you truly are was never born and can never die. Now, I know this might sound abstract, so let me make it concrete with something that happened to me personally. A few years ago, I lost someone very close to me unexpectedly. The grief was overwhelming, but something interesting happened during the funeral. Instead of feeling only sadness, I found myself feeling incredibly alive. Every color seemed more vibrant, every conversation more meaningful, every moment more precious. It was as if being confronted with death had awakened me to life in a way I'd never experienced before. This is what both Jung and Spinoza understood. Death is not the enemy of life. Death is life's greatest teacher. It teaches us what matters and what doesn't. It strips away all the pretense and reveals what's essential. It forces us to confront the question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What does it mean to be truly alive? Jung discovered through decades of working with patients that people who had faced death, either their own mortality or the death of someone they loved, often experienced what he called a psychological rebirth. They stopped living according to other people's expectations and started living according to their own authentic nature. They stopped postponing joy and started embracing it. They stopped avoiding difficult conversations and started having them. They stopped waiting for permission to be themselves and started giving it to themselves. But here's where Spinoza's insight becomes absolutely crucial. He argued in Proposition 37 of his Ethics that fear of death actually decreases our power and vitality. When we're constantly anxious about dying, we're not fully present to living. We're like someone driving a car while constantly looking in the rear-view mirror, worried about what's behind them instead of focusing on where they're going. Spinoza had a radical solution to this problem. He suggested that instead of thinking about death as something that happens to you, you should think about it as something that reveals the preciousness of what you have right now. Every breath becomes a gift when you realize it's not guaranteed. Every sunset becomes a masterpiece when you understand you won't see infinite sunsets. Every conversation becomes sacred when you know that someday there will be a last conversation. This doesn't mean becoming morbid or obsessed with death. It means using the reality of death as a compass for living. Jung often told his patients to imagine they were writing their own eulogy, not in a depressing way, but as a way of clarifying what they actually valued. What would you want people to say about how you lived? What impact would you want to have had? What legacy would you want to leave behind? Most people, when they do this exercise, realize they've been living someone else's life. They've been pursuing goals that don't actually matter to them, maintaining relationships that drain their energy, avoiding risks that could lead to their greatest fulfillment. The awareness of death becomes a catalyst for authentic living. But Spinoza went even deeper. He believed that when you truly understand the nature of existence, you realize that death is not a punishment or a tragedy. It's simply part of the natural order. A flower doesn't fear withering because it understands its purpose is to bloom fully while it can. A wave doesn't resist returning to the ocean because it knows it was always part of the ocean to begin with. This is where Jung's psychology and Spinoza's philosophy converge in a beautiful way. Jung believed that the goal of human existence is to become individuated, to become fully yourself. Spinoza believed that the goal of existence is to express your unique nature as completely as possible. Both understood that the fear of death often prevents people from achieving this goal. Let me share something that might surprise you. Jung actually looked forward to death. Not because he was suicidal or depressed, but because he had lived so fully that he was curious about what came next. In his later years, he often spoke about death as the next great adventure. He had squeezed so much authentic living out of his years that he felt complete, ready for whatever transformation death might bring. Spinoza had a similar perspective, though he expressed it differently. He wrote that a wise person thinks least of all about death, and their meditation is not on death, but on life. This doesn't mean ignoring death or pretending it doesn't exist. It means using the awareness of death to focus more intensely on living with purpose and authenticity. Think about someone in your life who seems truly alive. I bet they have a different relationship with death than most people. They're not paralyzed by the fear of dying because they're too busy being fully present to living. They take risks that matter. They express love openly. They pursue their passions without apology. They've somehow made peace with mortality in a way that frees them to embrace life completely. This is what Jung called living from the self rather than from the ego. The ego is terrified of death because it thinks it is the body and the personality. But the self, according to Jung, is connected to something timeless and universal. When you live from the self, you're not constantly defending against death because you're aligned with life itself. Spinoza would say you're aligned with what he called God or nature, the infinite creative principle that expresses itself through every living thing. When you understand that you are a unique and irreplaceable expression of this infinite creativity, death loses its sting, because you realize that what you truly are participates in eternity. Now I want you to consider something that might make you uncomfortable. What if you've been living your entire life as if you were immortal? What if you've been postponing the conversations that matter, avoiding the risks that could transform you, settling for less than what your soul craves because you assume you'll have unlimited time to course correct later? Both Jung and Spinoza would tell you that this is the real tragedy. Not that you're going to die, but that you might die without ever having truly lived. Not that your body will eventually stop functioning, but that your spirit might never fully awaken. Not that your time is limited, but that you might waste the time you have on things that don't actually matter to you. Here's something practical you can do right now. Jung often recommended what he called active imagination, a process where you have an honest dialogue with different parts of yourself. Tonight, before you go to sleep, imagine having a conversation with death, not as a grim reaper or a terrifying specter, but as a wise counselor who can help you clarify what's truly important. Ask death what it wants to teach you. Ask what you should stop doing, what you should start doing, what you should do more of, what you should do less of. Don't be surprised if the answers challenge everything you thought you knew about how you should be living. Spinoza believed that this kind of honest self-reflection was essential for what he called the intellectual love of God. This wasn't religious love in the conventional sense, but a deep appreciation for the magnificent complexity and beauty of existence itself. When you develop this love, death becomes not an enemy, but a reminder of how precious and temporary your particular expression of existence truly is. Jung made a similar point in a different way. He observed that people who had near-death experiences often reported feeling more alive than they ever had before. They didn't become fearless in a reckless way, but they became fearless in an authentic way. They stopped being afraid of judgment, stopped being afraid of failure, stopped being afraid of being themselves, fully and completely. This is what both thinkers understood about the hidden truth of death. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is what gives life its urgency, its poignancy, its preciousness. A sunset is beautiful partly because it doesn't last forever. A piece of music moves us partly because it comes to an end. A human life has meaning partly because it's finite and irreplaceable. What would happen if you stopped running from death and started dancing with it? What would happen if instead of seeing mortality as a limitation, you saw it as liberation from having to live forever according to other people's expectations? What would happen if you realized that you don't have to earn your existence or justify your place in the universe, but simply express your authentic nature as fully as possible? While you have the chance, Jung worked with thousands of patients over his career, and he noticed something fascinating. The people who were most afraid of death were usually the people who were most afraid of life. They were afraid of taking risks, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of standing out, afraid of being judged. But the people who had made peace with mortality were often the most vibrantly alive people he knew. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. If you're constantly worried about preserving your life, you can't fully live it. If you're always playing it safe to avoid death, you're also avoiding the experiences that make life worth living. If you're paralyzed by the fear of ending, you can't embrace the beauty of beginning each day with fresh possibilities. Spinoza put it this way in his Ethics. He said that everything in existence has what he called conatus, a fundamental drive to persevere and express its nature. A tree reaches towards sunlight not because it's afraid of dying, but because it's committed to living. A bird sings, not to avoid death, but to celebrate life. A human being, according to Spinoza, finds true happiness not by avoiding death, but by expressing their unique essence as completely as possible. This doesn't mean being reckless or self-destructive. Both Jung and Spinoza valued wisdom and careful consideration. But they also understood that true wisdom includes accepting the reality of mortality and using that acceptance to prioritize what matters most. They knew that the energy you spend trying to avoid the inevitable is energy you're not spending on creating, loving, growing, and contributing. Let me ask you something personal. When you imagine your death, what do you regret most? Is it the things you did or the things you didn't do? Is it the risks you took or the risks you avoided? Is it the love you expressed or the love you kept hidden? Most people, when they're honest, realize that their biggest regrets are about authenticity not attempted, connections not made, truths not spoken, dreams not pursued. Jung called this the unlived life, and he believed it was one of the primary sources of psychological suffering. When you suppress your authentic nature out of fear, whether fear of death, fear of judgment, fear of failure, or fear of rejection, you create what he called a shadow. This shadow contains all the unexpressed aspects of yourself, and it tends to emerge in destructive ways if you don't consciously integrate it. Spinoza would agree, but he would frame it in terms of decreased vitality and power. When you live according to external expectations rather than internal truth, when you choose safety over authenticity, when you prioritize survival over thriving, you actually weaken your life force. You become less yourself, which means you become less alive. The antidote, according to both thinkers, is radical self-acceptance combined with courageous self-expression. This means acknowledging all aspects of yourself, including the parts that might not fit social expectations. It means pursuing what genuinely matters to you, even if it seems impractical or unconventional. It means speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes. It means loving fully, even though love makes you vulnerable. Here's something that might shock you. Both Jung and Spinoza believed that people who had integrated the reality of death were actually more capable of deep joy than people who tried to avoid thinking about mortality. This seems counterintuitive, but it makes perfect sense when you understand their reasoning. When you accept that your time is limited, every experience becomes more vivid. When you realize that you won't be here forever, you pay attention differently. When you understand that this conversation, this sunset, this embrace might not happen again, you show up more fully. Mortality doesn't diminish life. Mortality intensifies life. Jung often spoke about what he called the transcendent function, the psychological process that allows apparent opposites to be held in creative tension. Life and death are not really opposites, he argued. They're complementary aspects of a larger mystery. When you can hold both the joy of being alive and the reality of mortality in your consciousness simultaneously, something beautiful happens. You stop taking existence for granted and start treating it as the extraordinary gift it actually is. Spinoza made a similar point, using the language of philosophy rather than psychology. He argued that when you understand yourself as part of the infinite web of existence, individual death loses its terror, because you realize that you're participating in something eternal. Not eternal in the sense that your personality survives death, but eternal in the sense that the creative force expressing itself through you is inexhaustible and continues in countless other forms. This might sound abstract, but it has profoundly practical implications. When you stop being primarily motivated by the fear of death, you can start being motivated by love of life. When you're not constantly defending against ending, you can focus on beginning. When you're not paralyzed by mortality, you can be energized by possibility. What would you do if you weren't afraid of dying? What conversations would you have? What creative projects would you start? What adventures would you embark on? What love would you express? What truth would you speak? What dream would you pursue? The answers to these questions reveal what your soul actually wants, as opposed to what your fear thinks you need. Jung discovered that many of his patients experienced profound healing when they stopped running from death and started running toward life. This didn't happen through positive thinking or denial, but through what he called the confrontation with the shadow. They had to face their deepest fears, including the fear of mortality, in order to discover their deepest desires. One of Jung's most famous patients was a woman who came to him because she was paralyzed by anxiety about death. She couldn't make decisions, couldn't form close relationships, couldn't pursue her artistic interests because she was constantly worried about losing everything. Jung didn't try to convince her that death wasn't real or that she shouldn't be concerned about it. Instead, he helped her explore what death meant to her. Through months of analysis, she discovered that her fear of death was actually a fear of judgment. She had been raised to believe that she had to earn her right to exist by being perfect, and she was terrified that death would reveal her inadequacy. Once she realized this, she could begin the process of accepting herself as she actually was, rather than as she thought she should be. Paradoxically, accepting her mortality helped her start truly living. Spinoza would have understood this dynamic perfectly. He believed that most human suffering comes from what he called inadequate ideas about reality. When you have a distorted understanding of death, you also have a distorted understanding of life. When you think death is a punishment, you might also think life is a test you have to pass. When you think death is a failure, you might also think success means avoiding death at all costs. But what if death is simply a transition? What if life is not a test, but an opportunity? What if existence is not something you have to earn, but something you get to express? These different perspectives completely change how you approach every day of your life. Both Jung and Spinoza understood that wisdom involves accepting what you cannot control, while taking full responsibility for what you can control. You cannot control when or how you will die, but you can control how fully you live. You cannot control the fact that your body will eventually cease functioning, but you can control whether you express your authentic nature while it's functioning. You cannot control the ultimate mystery of what happens after death, but you can control what kind of legacy you create while you're alive. This brings us to one of the most profound insights that both thinkers shared. They believed that people who had made peace with death were paradoxically more committed to life. When you're not wasting energy on futile attempts to avoid the inevitable, you have more energy available for creating, connecting, contributing, and celebrating. Think about the people in your life who seem most alive. I bet they've all had some kind of encounter with mortality that transformed their perspective. Maybe they survived a serious illness, lost someone they loved, or had a near-death experience. These encounters didn't make them morbid or depressed. They made them more present, more grateful, more authentic, more loving. This is what Jung called the wisdom of the wounded healer. People who have been touched by death often become more skilled at helping others embrace life. They've learned something that can't be taught from books or lectures. They've learned that mortality is not the enemy of meaning, but the source of meaning. Spinoza approached this from a slightly different angle, but arrived at the same conclusion. He argued that when you understand the interconnectedness of all existence, individual death becomes less frightening because you realize that nothing is ever truly lost. The energy that animates your body returns to the source. The love you've shared continues to influence others. The ideas you've contributed become part of the collective wisdom of humanity. This doesn't require believing in any particular religion or metaphysical system. It simply requires recognizing that you are part of something larger than your individual existence. When a wave returns to the ocean, the wave form disappears, but the water continues. When a song ends, the silence that follows contains the echo of the music. When a life ends, the influence of that life continues to ripple through time in ways both seen and unseen. Now I want to challenge you with something that both Jung and Spinoza would insist upon. Are you living as if you were immortal, or are you living as if your time is precious and limited? Are you postponing authenticity until someday when it feels safer, or are you expressing your truth now while you have the opportunity? Are you avoiding risks that could lead to growth, or are you embracing the uncertainty that makes life an adventure? The hidden truth about death that both thinkers discovered is that it's actually a doorway to life. Not life after death, but life before death. Not some mystical existence in another realm, but fully awakened existence in this realm. Not immortality in the future, but intensity in the present. Jung often said that the goal of the first half of life is to establish yourself in the world, but the goal of the second half is to discover what the world means to you. This discovery usually requires confronting mortality. It requires asking yourself what you would do if you knew your time was limited, what legacy you want to leave, what love you want to express, what contribution you want to make. Spinoza would say it requires understanding your place in the grand scheme of existence and expressing your unique nature as completely as possible. This is not selfish or narcissistic. It's actually the most generous thing you can do because the world needs your particular gifts, your unique perspective, your irreplaceable contribution. Here's something practical you can do starting today. Both Jung and Spinoza recommended regular reflection on mortality, not as a morbid obsession, but as a clarifying practice. Every evening ask yourself, if today had been my last day, would I be satisfied with how I lived it? What would I want to do differently tomorrow? What matters most, and am I prioritizing it? This isn't about becoming perfect or living without any regrets. It's about aligning your daily choices with your deepest values. It's about recognizing that every day is both ordinary and miraculous, routine and unrepeatable, familiar and precious. The truth that most people avoid is that death is not something that happens to you at the end of your life. Death is happening constantly. Every moment, cells in your body are dying and being replaced. Every breath, you're exhaling part of your life force. Every day, you're a slightly different person than you were the day before. Life and death are not separate events, but ongoing processes. When you understand this, you can stop thinking of death as a distant threat and start thinking of it as a present teacher. What is dying in your life right now that needs to die? What old patterns, limiting beliefs, toxic relationships, or unfulfilling situations are ready to be released? What new aspects of yourself are ready to be born? Jung called this psychological death and rebirth, and he believed it was essential for psychological health. You cannot become who you're meant to be without letting go of who you used to be. You cannot embrace your authentic self without releasing the false self you've been performing. You cannot step into your full potential without allowing your current limitations to die. Spinoza would frame this in terms of increasing your power and vitality. Every time you release something that diminishes your life force, you make space for something that enhances it. Every time you let go of a fear that constrains you, you create room for a joy that expands you. Every time you allow a false identity to die, you permit a true identity to emerge. This is the ultimate paradox that both Jung and Spinoza understood about death. By accepting mortality, you become more alive. By embracing impermanence, you discover what's eternal within you. By making peace with ending, you learn how to begin. What would your life look like if you stopped being afraid of death and started being grateful for life? What would you create, express, explore, share, or become if you knew that your time was limited but your potential was vast? What dreams would you pursue? What love would you declare? What truth would you speak if you remembered that every day is a gift and every moment is unrepeatable? This is the vision that both Jung and Spinoza offer us. Not a life without death, but a life illuminated by the awareness of death. Not immortality, but intensity. Not endless time, but meaningful time. Not survival, but thriving. Not existing, but truly living. The hidden truth about death is that it's not the opposite of life. It's life's most profound teacher, most honest mirror, most powerful motivator. When you stop running from death, you can start dancing with life. When you accept mortality, you can embrace vitality. When you make peace with ending, you can celebrate beginning. This is the wisdom that both Carl Jung and Baruch Spinoza discovered through decades of deep reflection and careful observation. Death is not something to fear, but something to learn from. Not something to avoid, but something to integrate. Not the enemy of meaning, but the source of meaning. In this video, our objective is not to affirm that this vision is the only correct one. We want to present the thesis of these great thinkers as an intellectual provocation, critical thinking, and instruction in an impactful yet secular way, without inducing anyone to blind acceptance or despair about mortality. The intention is to open space for critical thinking, encourage reflection, and allow each person to decide for themselves how to relate to the mystery of death and the gift of life. We present not an absolute truth, but a philosophical and psychological proposal that deserves to be known and questioned. This is the perspective of Jung and Spinoza, a bold and profound proposal that challenges conventional explanations about death and mortality. But here in this content, our goal is not to impose truths, it's to provoke reflection and bring information. And now I want to know which vision resonates with you. How do you choose to relate to mortality and meaning? Comment below, share this video if it helped you in some way, and subscribe to continue this journey of discovery about life's deepest questions.